We will also be recording the Zoom session for today's meeting. There are people in the room as well who will be taking photographs. If you would not like to be photographed, please do inform me, and we will ensure that that will not happen. So this is the second in our Leiden Birmingham lecture series. Both universities have similar interests with regards to sign languages. We have some exciting presentations, and this will be very interesting in terms of mutual developments. After today's presentations, we will be having a roundtable. We will be discussing future research, future projects. And then we will be creating a seedbed of ideas, really thinking about how we can work together. So the first lecture was open, the second and third are closed. So we can see the topics here, the themes for each lecture series, or each lecture rather. So today's theme is language evolution and diachronic change. So a little bit about diachronic change. We're looking about the history of sign language, language change, language evolution. Previously, all research was focused on spoken languages, based largely on written records. But how can we do this for sign languages? Sign languages have far fewer written records. And have vastly different time scales, so they're much younger languages typically. Sign languages also come from small communities and very few native speakers, with very few native speakers. One big difference between spoken and written languages and sign languages is modality. We can also think about how new technologies have impacted communication. So this is the agenda for today's meeting. So it'll be very interesting to see all of these presentations, to see these many, many projects on sign languages. So I would like to invite our first presenter to the floor.
Hey, hopefully the interpreting's going okay and everybody can hear what they need to be able to hear to access this. I need to be slightly closer, I'm told. Excellent. So I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much to Victoria and Gerardo for running this session. I'm so pleased to be here. These two universities are universities that I've worked with in both of, so I'm very proud to be able to see this very special collaboration. So my PhD was at Leiden University, and I've since worked to take a position as a postdoc here at Birmingham. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted to see this collaboration today. Thank you so much. So it's great to see everybody signing an international. That's really wonderful. Hopefully we're going to see more and more of that, hearing people signing in international signs. So great work there, Gerardo. Wonderful start. Thank you so much. So the title of my presentation today is I Want the World to See Me and Understand Me. And the research that I focused on is the impact of international sign on national sign languages. So this will be familiar to many people. Social media has had a big impact, not just on deaf communities, but on all communities globally. And the use of English in social media has had a very big impact on the world and how we use language. English has always been a predominant language in many forms of multinational communication, and now we're seeing more and more opportunities for participation and collaboration using English in social media. So why do digital creators use English on social media? What are the reasons for people not choosing to use their own language, but instead choosing to use English on these platforms? And here are some examples that we see from other previous research. So we see examples from Finland, from Indonesia, we see examples from the Netherlands, and also from Greece as well, about how people want to increase their reach, increase their visibility through the use of English on these platforms. So this sense that because there's this common conception that people will be able to access things in English, there's a wider reach that's attainable using this language on social media. Also, another reason is around necessity. So, for example, there's some research here that's been undertaken around access to minority communities, so gay people in Mongolia not being able to access support in their own countries and being able to find social networks that they can have support through in the use of English. So having English as a way of being able to access wider networks and being able to seek out particular communities that maybe align with individuals' identities, and being able to do that through English provides a wider network for this. Also, information as a tool and information as a resource. Often with many minority languages or smaller languages, information isn't available so predominantly in those languages. So being able to use English enables access to information you wouldn't be able to further be able to access. And I'll be talking more about these points later in my presentation as well. So a third reason when people are choosing to maybe speak between English and their own native language, so code switching, that's something that we see quite a lot happening. And there are some examples here from previous research that have talked about this. So people code switching between Arabic and English within populations in Jordan. Also, again, we see research about people code switching between Indonesian and English, and then Finnish and English as well. So on social media, we see people accessing information in English and also presenting information, maybe not just in English, but also code switching between their language and English. So how does this apply to the context which we are talking about today, which is sign languages? So I wanted to think about Portuguese Sign Language and focus very much on that community. Sorry if I just back up a little bit there. So if I talk about my research, I conducted 80 interviews. This is an important part. And the participants were between 16 and 88. So I had some people from a really wide variety of different experiences, and I did purposive sampling where I managed to find people using networks of other people and managed to create quite a large pool of data through these interviews. So there's a couple of images here you can see on the slide. Your right is a picture of the old Deaf Club As you can see, there's lots of people there. It's very well attended on a Friday and a Saturday. I remember growing up as a young person at the age of 16 onwards, attending this social event. At that time, of course, people didn't have smartphones, so face-to-face interactions were even more important. So this was a site for data collection. People said that previously most people's access to sign language happened in these sites, and people used Portuguese Sign Language predominantly because they had these very strong local networks of people that also used Portuguese Sign Language. Whereas now, because of patterns of socialisation having changed, not just within deaf communities, but more widely, some of the language shifts have happened around this too. And you can see this quote on the slide here, which is social media is a virtual deaf club. And we see this idea permeating in deaf communities now. So social media gives deaf people a virtual space. And it's true. We see this when people maybe don't necessarily have the opportunities to go to physical deaf spaces in the way they used to, and instead they access these spaces online. It's the new deaf club. So you can see that there are less people in Deaf Club now than there used to be. And also you can see how people are accessing other communication when they're in Deaf Club. They're looking at videos, they're looking at social media, they're looking at people signing, and that's not necessarily just in Portuguese Sign Language, that's also often in other sign language and international sign. So why do deaf influencers use international sign? We've seen an upsurge in the number of deaf influencers, and you can see people from different countries flagged here on the slide. So I was interested in why these individuals were choosing to present themselves using international sign. And here we see the presenter on the slide saying that they think it's important to be able to provide access to a wider community of people. And here we have a British presenter saying that international sign means that more deaf people can access this. And again, we see these ideologies repeated by other influencers here. Using international sign is an idea that means everybody can access. Yes, international sign is available for everybody, so that's why it's important to us. So people want to use international sign in these communications so they can be globally visible. And this idea is repeated over and over again, and also completely maps with the idea of using English on social media in the same way we see with hearing influencers. So these are individuals from Portugal. So that we see one person who is wearing green, and they are now a new influencer, but the others are all just individuals that maybe make their own videos and communicate on social media, but sometimes use a mix of either international sign or Portuguese sign. So I asked them why they choose to use international sign. What's the reasoning behind that? And they had this idea that it meant they had more global visibility. It's seen as a parallel for the use of English as a global communication tool. And they said they play online games, and if they use IS, they can communicate with wider pools of people internationally than they would if they were just using Portuguese Sign Language. That wouldn't be possible to be able to communicate so broadly with just using Portuguese Sign Language. So there's this real global ideology around the use of international sign in these spaces. And also maybe looking from a different perspective, people wanting to be seen, but also then what do the audience make of this? I wanted to look at audience perceptions of international sign as well. And lots of people don't necessarily create videos, but they often access live chats, live spaces. So it's not just pre-recorded videos, but also people are watching these communications happening live on Instagram or on other social media fields. So I asked people about what they thought of this. And the first lady here in the pink top, she went to a deaf school and she was very badly bullied in that school. And then she left. And since then, she hasn't really engaged in the deaf community. She's been quite isolated. But of course, she has this need for communication in sign language, and being able to access information online and access signing communities online has given her this support network. So over the last year, she's actually started coming back to Deaf Club. And I said, I remember that we'd been to school together, and she was using a lot of international sign, and that was confusing to me at first. And she said that she just hadn't really used Portuguese Sign Language very much, because they were using much, much more communication with international deaf people than they were with other Portuguese people, because there were other people out there. Was a wider pool of people that hadn't had this bad experience with at school, and other people had similar experiences too. Here we see a 16-year-old here, and also somebody who's 40. And the 16-year-old went to a mainstream school, and now we see there's more and more access provided through interpreters to education for deaf people rather than going to deaf schools. And also we see that because people don't necessarily have sign language based interaction in their break and play times, they are using social media to interact even at school. And it means that this person said they don't necessarily feel alone anymore. And this other individual, who's a man who went to a deaf school, he then returned to a very remote part of Portugal once he'd finished school. He feels very lonely because he doesn't have that interaction with other people who live around him. So these people are people who've never travelled but have learned international sign remotely. So this is quite different from the way that people have traditionally engaged with international sign by going to spaces and places where deaf people are interacting internationally. Some other perspectives we had here, that people talked about access to things that were happening in current affairs, so world events, what's happening in the news. People were saying that they were struggling to access this information on Portuguese channels, but actually being able to access these information through international sign meant that they were getting a lot more current affairs, a lot more world perspectives on news, for example, the war in Ukraine, because they could access information using international sign. And there's another individual here who's transgender, and they said in Portugal there's only 4 people who are deaf and transgender. So they've not been able to find their community or that support in person. But internationally, there's a much bigger deaf community of people who have had shared experiences. And by using international sign, they were able to engage with a wider pool of people that had this shared identity. And of course, this is so important to be able to have this support in the language that you can access. So we see contrasting ideologies here. So firstly, we have this ideology around being wanting to be seen, but also this necessity of needing to see others. And it's interesting, in all of the interviews, people said things like, oh, international sign is so cool, it's so beautiful, it's so perfect, it's so great. Oh, I love the way that it's so fluid, so harmonious. And I tried to find other articles that talked about that in other countries, about people saying maybe English is more beautiful. And I struggled to find that. I found one in the end, but certainly not enough to find again more parallels between English and international sign. So I looked at comparisons between European countries and other spoken languages, and this one article that compared 16 European languages said that English is considered one of the most beautiful. But the ideology that came up again and again and again where deaf people talked about international sign was that it was beautiful and special in a way that hearing people didn't speak about English and its international reasoning. So again, maybe there is this parallel. So maybe we'll see more of a use of English in these spaces in future. We know that there's often a risk in globalization that English might become a killer language. And there has been previous research that's been undertaken, but most of this has been quite superficial. So the first book we see on the slide here was It's a Small World. And one topic here was around Turkish Sign Language and somebody researching the growth of international sign. But this was more as a result of people having face-to-face interactions and social interactions, people going to different spaces. But again, this is very limited. This isn't an in-depth research study. The next, we have an article from New Zealand, which talks about the influence of American Sign Language on New Zealand Sign Language. So this again is an interesting article in relation to this. But again, this doesn't talk so much about the experience of social media. And then we have this very recent book by 4 key authors that's looked at different sign languages and the context of those national sign languages and the influence of international sign. So we see, again, similar themes occurring in different countries, but not in any great detail in terms of the level of research yet. So I conducted linguistic ethnography, both in person and digital linguistic ethnography, to look at the linguistic landscape for international sign and Portuguese sign. I also conducted some interviews in these focus groups where people had communication. So they talked about Instagram Live and the use of Instagram Live and the mixing of Portuguese Sign Language and international sign. And when we talked about mixing, I wanted to try to better understand and interrogate those notions. Is this code mixing or is this code switching? And I wanted to look to this further to try and better understand these linguistic practices. So I both filmed and observed different interactions. So this first one here is a dinner at a restaurant between 4 friends. I wasn't there. I just had this to be filmed for 1 hour. And then also this is an Instagram live event that was recorded for an hour as well. So I had both of these videos and I was able to use ELAN to analyse the data. And again, I was able to look at the percentages of how much international sign was occurring in this communication. So I looked at, sometimes this was one lexical item, sometimes it was a short phrase, and there were 6.5% of IS signs in the face-to-face interaction, but in the digital interaction, I saw 34%. At the start, there was more international sign used, and then there was a shift towards Portuguese Sign Language. It seemed to depend on what topic was being used, what was being discussed. And then towards the end, there was more of a shift again. So it's interesting to see these translanguaging strategies in play. And, you know, these individuals only come together on a Friday or Saturday, maybe for 3 to 6 hours. Whereas these online interactions are happening all the time. They happen every day. They could be 3 hours or up as long as 8 hours long. So again, there's more and more opportunities for international sign to be used in these spaces. So in conclusion, we see more and more Portuguese deaf people choosing to use international sign. And what does this lead to in terms of language change in Portuguese Sign Language? It's something for us to further consider and an interesting topic for us looking forward. Thank you very much. I will return to my seat now. Thank you. Oh dear, yes, we've got some drips on the floor here, slightly dangerous maybe. Thank you so much, Marta. Really, really interesting presentation there. And also perfectly on time. Well done. So we have a full 10 minutes now for questions. If people have questions, if I can ask they come to the front, please, that would be very helpful.
Beautiful presentation. So I have 2 questions to pose.
You can just orientate yourself so you're better on camera. Thank you. Yeah, switch.
Needs to move around. Sorry, I couldn't.
So my first question has to do with grammar. I was wondering if there was a grammatical shift that was happening in Portuguese Sign Language or simply a lexical, a process of lexical loaning. I think that.
Yeah, I've had this question before.
This is not necessarily related to your topic, but as we know, international sign has a lot of influences from American Sign Language. I'm not entirely sure if we know the percentage necessarily of ASL signs that are being used in international sign and then within these spaces. So I'm just wondering if you have any information about that.
So firstly, yes. So when you asked me that question, I looked to Adam Shembry, my colleague, because we had this conversation yesterday, in fact. So in terms of the influence, I don't know. I can see that there's lots of not only lexical items that are influencing the way the sign language is being produced, but also I see more and more young people who are using this mixture of international sign. I think we need more research around this. So I can't really answer that question currently, but I think it's an excellent question for us to consider moving forward. So thank you for that. Secondly, I think it's very, very hard to say about the percentage of ASL signs in international sign because it depends so much. We know that international sign isn't one set of lexicon. It shapes itself and orientates itself by the users and the spaces in which they're working in. So we see in African contexts a lot of ASL, for example, but less so maybe in Arabic contexts or other contexts. And I think within Arabic sign, there's this degree of flexibility. And the first time we see this use of international sign was in Paris in the 1800s. So the Paris banquets, we see this emergence of people coming together in these spaces and places, these great historical events. So of course there were instances of deaf gatherings that used international sign before then, but when there were real opportunities for the language to develop probably came around this time. So before that, there probably would have been more contexts where it was quite regionalised. But because of social media, we're now seeing more of a global interaction being able to happen in international sign. And we see a lot of influence from Arabic sign because the world now can communicate using international sign without having to travel. And again, I think it's a real privilege to be able to travel, but now people who didn't necessarily have that privilege have those opportunities in a way they were never previously afforded them. So international sign certainly has changed as a result of social media and opportunities to communicate in different ways.
Lovely presentation. It made me think about one specific thing, specifically code switching and code mixing. I am also thinking about translanguaging. So people have their own linguistic repertoire, so they may have Portuguese Sign Language, but something may arise that will not be Portuguese Sign Language wouldn't be able to account for. So then they use languages in other languages in their repertoire to communicate something. So I'm just wondering where translanguaging fits in with all of this.
Yes, thank you for that question. So previously, I was thinking about the language impact and I was thinking about the lexical influence of international sign. More recently, I've started thinking about code switching and code mixing. And again, I think I need to interrogate some of these ideas more. I've read a little around this, but I haven't really focused on this in terms of the data. So there's something that I would like to look into further, but maybe previous research will happen around this and we can have further conversations. I think that'd be very interesting. It's a very good question. Okay, we can't see whoever's signing there, so if you'd like that to be voiced over, it'd be useful. Okay, we're just waiting to switch to the screen. And there we are. Are there more questions in the room? Anybody else in the room or online have a question that they would like to ask? Yeah, please do come forward. If you can just orientate yourself towards the camera so the interpreters can see you.
So I'm curious about percentage with regards to code mixing and code switching, if you look at remote environments versus in-person environments. I'm also wondering about regionality. So if in the north of Portugal, there will be more use of international sign versus in the cities, in remote areas, etc.
Thank you. Yes, I didn't cover that really in this presentation, but I showed individuals from Portugal, but also we know that there are wider networks of people outside as well. And I saw a variety of different practices. And sometimes in some of these online settings, I didn't know where people were necessarily from. But also, we know that Brazilian participants who also have some Portuguese may be engaging in these settings as well. So we know that people maybe had Portuguese Sign Language, International Sign, and Libras. So some of the people that I spoke to were using Libras, even though I knew they'd never been to Brazil. And they had started to use international sign as a tool to learning Libras. And again, we're having more opportunity to access Libras because of these online settings. So also we saw lots of contact between people in Arabic regions as well, people who'd never been to these regions in person. So we had these groups of people that were mostly from Portugal in person, but in the online discussions, there were wider pools of people and quite broad representation from different countries. And just one more question. So somebody online, somebody from Ireland has asked a question. And the question is, I'm interested in the point about young people learning IS to connect with others. And I'm wondering, are there contexts where IS is taught as a foreign language in school to young people rather than having to seek it out themselves? So in the Portuguese context, we know that there is a Portuguese Sign Language education programme for children from birth until high school. So there's a programme for how to teach Portuguese Sign Language. Within that programme, from the age of 13 or 14, you can start teaching some international sign as well. But most teachers say that we don't need to do that because young people know that already. Often they know more than the teacher does. So, and also often international sign is fast moving, so it's not necessarily helpful to have these things in the curriculum. Lovely. Thank you so much. We are out of time for your presentation. If we can have a round of applause for Marta, our lovely first presenter, please. And we can ask our second presenter of this morning, Adrien Dadone, to come to the floor, please.
Right, I'll go ahead and get started then. So in the same vein as Marta, I would also like to thank the Universities of Leiden and Birmingham. So Marta focused mostly on the sociolinguistic aspects of sign languages. I'm going to be focusing more on grammar. So I'm going to be focusing on causative-GIVE in LSF, which is French Sign Language, and French, the spoken language. It seems that they may actually have common roots and then have differed in use since that initial origin. I worked with Patricia Cabredo Hofher from CNRS. in Paris. So there may be some people in this room and online who are unfamiliar with causatives. So I'll give you an example. We have in French, coffee, or in LSF rather, coffee gives me nervous. Another example from spoken French. You can see this sentence here. I'll translate it into international sign. Courir me donne soif. So running makes me thirsty. So something has happened and it has caused a shift in me. So it has given me something. That is a causative. So there's a difference between the lexical item, for example, book, give, money, give. So that person gave me a book, that person gave me money. There's a different lexical item here. We're focusing specifically on the causative itself, as expressed through give. So these are the claims of my presentation. First, that the give causative in LSF comes from French, spoken French, through language contact. Secondly, that the grammar has shifted in usage. There is a limit to the causative give in French that LSF has not undergone. So there has been a forking in use. So we in LSF, we can use the causative give, and we can use iconicity as well. I'll be talking a little bit more about iconicity as it presents itself with the causative give. And the causative give presents itself in both iconic and non-iconic structures. So a bit of an outline for my presentation. I'm going to be talking about language contact between LSF and French. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about contrasts between LSF and French give causatives. I'm going to be talking about contrast between causative give and lexical give in LSF. And then I'm going to be talking about contrasts between LSF, LSF give causatives, and other expressions of causality in LSF. And then I will be concluding. Just a summary of everything I will have imparted upon you. So we can think about language contact within deaf communities. Of course, we have to understand signing deaf communities as linguistic minorities operating within the same geographies as their hearing counterparts, and so they can't avoid spoken and written languages, the spoken and written languages around them. We also have to think about how many deaf people are actually born to hearing families, which is about 95%. And so they're being exposed to these spoken languages at all times. They're also being exposed to the written format of these languages through SMS texts, through billboards, through posters, through the books around them, etc. So my hypothesis is the following. We can assume that LSF was inspired by the French causative give. We can see this in the mouthing, in the labialization of don, which comes from donner in French. And we can see that the usage is fairly similar initially. We can also consider that the grammar is similar, but in spoken French, we actually have two expressions that we can use. We can say donner, to give, or we could use another word, faire. We can see that here, faire, which means to make or to provoke, cause something. In spoken French, we use faire much more often. So my question is, why did LSF not use faire? And why has it opted for donner or don? We can also see this being produced in English as well. Faire can be directly translated as to make. So this sign, faire, in LSF, could have been used in LSF, but it has not been used in LSF for a causative. It is also not directional in the same way that give is directional. So if something happens to me, how do we express that directionality? This has already been established within the grammar, and faire not being directional then is limited in nature. And therefore would not be used as a causative. It's also not, faire is also not considered a light verb in spoken French. So in French, you can say je fais du vélo, which is I ride a bike. But we would not use this in LSF. We would just say I bike, showing the pedals of the bike. So this gives us one reason as to why we would not use faire being borrowed from French and would instead opt for donner as a causative. We can then contrast between the give causatives in LSF and in French. So for the first example, this is the same sentence. LSF has donner as a lexical item and as a causative, and these being separate functions. So we could say Pierre give advance, or Pierre give book. So we have this classifier here of being given something. But you can also say Pierre give advance. So we have this verb, and this verb suggests that there's a change in the status of something. This is different to when someone is giving someone something, right? This is a different function. So now I'm going to be focusing a little bit on the semantics of spoken French and LSF with regards to the causative. So in LSF, you can say, we can use this as a predicate. So for example, running gives me thirst, or smoke gives me sneeze, And these are both stative and dynamic. But in spoken French, we only have donner as a stative, producing a stative result. So donner peur, du chagrin, so it makes me fearful or it makes me sad / regretful. So we can't actually say donner to give sneeze, right? To cause someone to sneeze. So we can also talk about how donner, the give causative in LSF, can mark a change in degree that does not happen in spoken French. So we can say in LSF, that give coughing. That gives me coughing, which means that causes me to cough. Or medication give health good. So the degree of health has improved. Training give chess progress. So again, the degree of skill in chess has improved or changed. So we can use an article here in French to actually show that something has changed, but it doesn't work in the same way as in French Sign Language. Now I'm going to be comparing spoken French and an LSF with regards to the give causative some more. So in LSF, the give causative can allow for internally caused changes of state, and they do not necessarily need to be psychological, wherein French actually requires it to be psychological. So for example, we can have water give metal rust in LSF, or unhappy love stories give cry sad. So we can't do this in spoken French. I will skip this. So with regards to LSF, having the give causative and the lexical give, we have things that would be produced with two hands. We can say book give with two hands, book give with one hand. The movement is dynamic here. There are morphological differences. We can pass books around, for example, using both hands. We can also use classifiers to express give through the lexical framework. So, but the causative is always two-handed. The lexical item of give in French Sign Language can work metaphorically as well. So, for example, imparting knowledge. But you can't actually do this with the causative as well. So it is fixed in terms of form, albeit directional. So I'd like to talk a little bit about iconicity as it relates to the causative give. So I have a video here to show an example. So we can see the iconic features of this expression here. We can see it here. So sunlight, radiate, hormone, happiness development. So sunlight stimulates the development of the happiness hormone. And we see with the radiating of the sun, the classifier for the sun, that's enough to actually express the same sort of idea of the causative give. So we don't actually need the causative give here. So this shows a change in state. The radiation of the sun causes a hormone development, stimulates the development of the happiness hormone. So we can see this directionality we can see this directionality by way of the radiation of the sun. But then, as opposed to this clip, we actually see that they are using the causative, the give causative, by way of the sun is good for morale. There is no iconicity here, and so they need to supplement it with something else. So in conclusion, it is possible that LSF borrowed the give causative from spoken French originally, but broadened its scope to not only focus on the psychological, but also the emotional, state changes, internal changes, etc. The lexical give and the causative give have some differentiation in terms of morphology, in terms of production. We can see that there is some lexical borrowing here, but it isn't copy-paste, right? It isn't something that has just been carried over and left alone as is. It actually has been changed to match the phonological and lexical system already in place, the grammatical system already in place. This is, the causative give is used to sort of supplement contexts in which iconicity is not being used to its full. So it's really to show a step-by-step process as to what is happening in a given scenario. And lastly, I would like to share some examples from some other sign languages. So we have Ugandan Sign Language here. We have a causative give. And we also have a causative give in Libras. So we have the lexical item, and then we have the actual causative. So book, give. So that's the lexical give. And then we have the causative. So the coffee gives me energy. So we can see this difference between the lexical and the causative. I'll play this in Libras now. So the wine makes me sleepy. So there's a difference between the use of the lexical give and the causative give in these other sign languages as well. Anyway, thank you for your time. I appreciate you all for being here.
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Really fascinating stuff there. So again, excellent timekeeping. So we have again a full 10 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions, if they'd like to come to the front, I see Adam Shambry is going to start. Great. Firstly, thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation, Adrien. So the example you gave there from Ugandan Sign Language, I think this is probably also influenced by English, because we can do the same thing in English here. So we say coffee gives me energy. So again, I think this might become from an influence of the spoken language in the same way you talked about the influence of French on LSF. Did you want to respond to that? Okay, and then secondly, the other question that I had was there was a really interesting example there from LSF. You showed so many examples, and I was just wondering how you collected those examples. Where did the examples come from? What was the elicitation process? Did these come from natural, spontaneously produced data, or where did the examples come from? If you could talk us through that, please.
So with regards to your first question about Ugandan Sign Language, yeah, I agree. Ugandan Sign Language has a huge American Sign Language influence, as do many of the other countries in the region. But we can see that the mouthing, the labialization, is different here. So she may be saying, coffee warms me up, and that is actually coming from a local language. The production on the mouth is coming from a local language rather than English for the causative. With regards to data collection, so I worked with a deaf colleague. We also created a video for social media and invited participants. And collected some videos. So really, it was those main processes. Yeah. Those main methodologies. I think there's an online question.
Yeah, we'll just change the screen to make sure that we can see an interpreter.
Yeah, because the next question will be spoken. Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. We have an interpreter. Wonderful.
Okay, are we ready?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So my question is, in many signed languages, the verb give is also used in sentences like girl give mother hug or boy give father push. So it's basically used as a form of light verb, one can say, or preposition maybe, to indicate the direction of the action. My question is, does this form of give also occur in LSF? And have you also looked at it in relation to causative-give?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, you were referring to for example, I give someone a push. Or I give a glass falling off the table. Is that correct?
No, actually the sign give is used. So in Flemish Sign Language, so for example, we say boy, give, girl, push. So there is the verb, the sign give.
Yeah, for the give causative, at least in LSF, we would not be using that for the pushing verb.
No, no. But my question is, do you also have give like in Flemish Sign Language? So I'm not saying it's causative. It is not causative. It indicates the direction of the action. So it's a form of a light verb. But my question is, do you have a similar use of give in LSF? And have you compared that one to the causative give?
So for this example, for pushing a person, we do have this, but we wouldn't use give necessarily. We usually rely on iconicity or other structures for that specific causative. So I guess they would be separate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we will stop there for now. We'll take a 15-minute break so people can go and get appropriate refreshments, pop to the bathroom as they need, and then we will return in 15 minutes to start with our next presentation. Thank you so much to everybody that's presented and asked questions so far.
Still alive. You have no idea.
Okay. Right. I think just checking we're ready to continue with our next presenter. Thank you so much, and the floor is now yours. Your microphone is switched off, so we can't actually hear you. If you could switch it on, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Hello? How about now?
But if there's sounds off, the interpreters won't be able to hear. Sorry about this. We're just having some technical issues. So we will change the order of presentations. So now we will ask the fourth presenter instead, Débora, to be the next presenter. Sorry for that. Okay, hopefully the interpreters can see me clearly. Yeah. I will then make a start. Much like Marta and Adrien, I would also like to thank those at Leiden University and Birmingham University for offering this fantastic opportunity to present and for us to get together. This is my sign name. I work at the University of Leiden and I am a researcher. So I have been looking at the narrative history of Libras, Brazilian Sign Language, recently, but before that I've undertaken a number of different research projects. And this is something that I'm just starting to delve into a little more. So I'm talking to you about some of my initial findings around this. So a little bit of context before we start. Libras, the sign language we use in Brazil, and this is the sign that we use, the acronym for that sign language. Many of you will know that initially the first school for the deaf was established with the use of LSF, Old French Sign Language, and this happened in many countries, including America, but also Brazil. So we see that the influence of Old LSF, Old French Sign Language, is prevalent in America, but also in Brazil. And we know that there was somebody who came from France to establish this school. And they initially came in 1856. And there was a very famous school in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. You'll be familiar with Rio de Janeiro. It's their very iconic structure that you will see of the Christ the Redeemer, the statue. And that's where the first deaf school was established in Brazil. And that school was in existence for many years before it then moved to Mexico. So we had an individual that came, a man by the name of Oates. This is his sign name. He was an American missionary. He had experience of using American Sign Language. He's another key figure in the development of our language. And he then came to Brazil in 1915. And he arrived in Brazil in the north and worked his way down the country. So he had lots of engagements with various deaf communities throughout Brazil. And he had this experience of being in the country for many years, travelling around Brazil from north to south, creating this dictionary, which was established in 1969. So many, many years of work went into creating this dictionary, and the work was created from all over Brazil. And it wasn't to validate Libras in any way, but it was just to show what we had and to evidence what was available and being used at that time. And this dictionary has been used for many years, and after that we saw the term Libras being used more globally. So again, a little bit more context about previous research into Libras. Some other people have conducted research, 4 key figures here on the slide. And I think it's important to say that all 4 of these individuals are deaf. So the first 2 women and the second 2 are men. And they have researched, firstly looking at influence of LSF in Libras. So looking at signs that are found both in Libras and with LSF, coming from this school in Rio. The next, using dictionaries, they've seen the work from Oates, the Oates dictionary, and researched comparatively using different sources. So looking at what happened in the deaf school in Rio. The third researcher used a different method. They looked at what signs were being used in the community, particularly by older and younger deaf individuals. And again, this is also important because there are different methods and different individuals. So we know that from Schmidt's research, the third individual here on the slide from 2013, he decided to not look at dictionaries. He decided to look at more naturalistic language production happening in the community by both deaf, older and younger people. So not in the whole of Brazil, but in the south of Brazil. And this is very interesting. And then the last individual here, so south of Rio, where this research happened. And then the most recent research, which was conducted just last year in 2024, this had a variety of different deaf participants, so 10 different deaf participants, so academics from across Brazil, and for them thinking about the engagement, so using international sign, using French Sign Language, using American Sign Language, and looking at different influences on Libras. And they found that about 10% of signs had been retained. So 90% of signs were independently Libras and 10% of signs were loan signs from other sign languages, including LSF. So this is the research that we have conducted into this so far. And they've all found similar things. There is some influence of LSF into Libras. But what about ASL? So we have seen that the first researcher said, Campello, said that there is some research from ASL, and again I'll talk a little bit more to that later. The second researcher, Dines, said that she didn't want to make any speculation around this and want to make too many decisions about influences. Schmidt's research didn't look at ASL, this wasn't the focus of that research, and Rodrigo Machado's research in 2024 did also think about ASL. And so again, I'm here to further extrapolate some of these ideas and think about drilling down in some of the claims that have been made previously. So in terms of change, we think about the first use of LSF, also the work of Oates, and then also what we see being used today more in the Brazilian context. So then 3 different categories that we're looking across. So we have the Débora text, the first text, and then also we have the text from Oates, and then we have a more recent usage here. So for example, the sign to drink, we see there's no change against the 3 different comparators. With the sign cup, we see there's phonological change. So we see the first sign here is around the provision of what's in the cup. And then more recently, we now see a very different description of cup than we have seen in previous iterations. And then also we looked at that lexical change as well. So the sign for coffee, the first and second signs here for coffee are completely separate, so lexically completely separate. And then thirdly, again, in more recent times, we found they're completely separate. So again, the difference between Débora and Oates, really illustrative here of change. So the first researcher that I mentioned earlier, they felt that there was ASL influence into Libras, and that was because of these lexical changes, the lexical categories being different. So the sign for rat, for example, initially there was the first sign that I've just used. Secondly, we see a completely different sign, and a sign which is more similar than in more recent usage. And instead of just thinking, is this influence from ASL, we wanted to drill down and interrogate more as to why this change might have happened. So again, my research question was thinking about the influence of ASL through Oates as a missionary, and also looking back further to LSF as an influence on the development of Libra. So these were the 2 things that I wanted to look to. So again, we see this example of the sign for rat. This is the current sign. And looking back into the history of American Sign Language, we look to see whether this sign has been present in American Sign Language previously. Because of technology now, it's very easy to access signs from different countries on various signed glossaries in a way that we weren't able to previously. So we looked at ASL to the sign for rat, and we see there are 2 signs that are commonly used. This is the first, this is the second. But again, I've tried to drill down, looking through manual dictionaries, paper dictionaries, to see if there's earlier examples of this sign that we use for rat, and there don't seem to be. So how did this sign rat emerge? So we look to the French dictionary, and we see there is an animal cat, so the same family, animal, cats and rats, similar family typographically. And we see there is this sign for cat that's iconic of the whiskers. So in the Oates dictionary, we don't have that sign, but we have this sign for cat. And I wonder if this has been reduced down in some way. So maybe they are from the same family. So maybe this again comes into Libras independently, but maybe with some influence there. So yes, we know there is some influence from Libras, on Libras from LSF and ASL, and we see various examples here again on the slide. So for example, the sign for book. And if we compare this to the Oates dictionary, we see a different sign being used here for book, whereas we see the sign for eat is still the same. So Libras has maintained this sign for eat, but it has changed. And is this a borrowing in Libras, or is this something that already existed prior to this collection? We also see comparison from ASL. I don't know where we saw this, if this came from ASL originally, or if it was LSF influence onto ASL and that's where it came from. But we can certainly see that there's a time period where this sign changed, and the sign for book certainly was a borrowed sign and now developed into an independent Libra sign at some point. And whilst we still see the sign, the older sign book sometimes occurring, it's not the predominantly used sign. So the Oates Dictionary is very important as part of our history of Libras. And in previous iterations, in 1915, we know that there was education provided in sign language, and it's very difficult to find information about that. It was very difficult to have internal support, so people came from abroad to establish schools. Also, we know that there was other religious education and other sign language being used in church as well that would have had influence, again, from missionaries from other countries. And the third dictionary is created by a deaf Brazilian priest, Dr. Padre Vicente Bernier. And again, we know that a lot of work happened collaboratively. So our third dictionary actually came as a result. He was taught originally by Eugene Oates as well, so there would have been influence on that work there too. So we have to think as well about the scale of Brazil. Brazil is a huge country. And if we think about schools for the deaf, I mentioned a previous school for the deaf in Rio de Janeiro. So people in that locality were very well connected traditionally. And with the Oates Dictionary, there have been over 20 editions. It's been very, very popular. It's been published and republished many, many times. So 20 different versions that have been sold over the years. And the last one, it was a decision in 1990, would be the last one, but it's a very significant text for us historically. And then many years later, so from 1969 to 1990, we decided that the last one would be made. And then in 2017, a new version was created, the Língua de Mouse. So this was published first in 2017. And again, these individuals looked to the Oates Dictionary and they followed some of the stylistics of that, but there are some modifications as well. So there was a comparison between the work. So that one of the things that was looked at was so the compounds that were found, the lexical items that were found by Oates, and then seeing how those were manifesting today. So Oates found there were numbers of various compounds that have now been replaced by one sign in Libras. So for example, the sign for find, before that was a compound sign, and now that's been replaced by just one of the two signs that previously formed that compound. So again, whilst that was found in the Oates Dictionary, it's not found in the current, most recent dictionary in Libras. So we've seen this diachronic change within Libras over the years, and having these dictionaries has enabled us to do this. Again, we see another example here. There was a sign that was previously two-handed has now become a one-handed sign. So this is the sign to have, which initially has been seen in LSF. In ASL, it's a different sign for have completely. But this sign again has been modified, so it doesn't still look like the production of the original LSF sign. And what we found, actually, whilst looking for this, is in a much earlier book, so prior to the Oates Dictionary, in a text from 1947, we see the first recorded example of this sign in Libras. So prior to oats existing, we see this sign existing, which makes us realise that actually this came from Libras and it isn't a borrowing from ASL. And again, we see some similarity from that text and the oats text, but to the current dictionary, again, there's more change. So again, the sign against, we see some change has happened. Most people in Brazil sign this sign for against. But 20 years ago, I think we saw a different sign being used more predominantly, particularly in some parts of Brazil. So in the north of Brazil, in some of those north communities, when I've asked about that sign being used, they said, I never used this older sign. I always used this sign that's more commonly used now. Whereas in Rio, when I asked these questions, I asked older and younger people about this sign, and they again said, I've never used this sign. And I was thinking, well, why does this sign occur in the dictionary when it seems that nobody's reporting that they've used this sign? And then eventually I found that there are places where this sign has been used. And again, some of this tells the beautiful story of Libras and how it is regional in some ways. And again, I think a lot more research is needed. So in the south, there were people who said that they'd used this sign, but again, the detail of where the sign was used wasn't necessarily recorded in the Oates dictionary. And I think it's important to be able to show that we have this. And this sign, again, relates to the LSF sign. So showing the history there. So again, thinking about why Libras wasn't influenced by ASL. So we see this sign here for can, which is an LSF sign. We see this from the 19th century. This sign has been considered the LSF sign for many years, but we see this sign here in Libras produced in a very different way. So that first sign from LSF also can be used in ASL, but we see the sign that's used in Libras has been the same for many, many years. And what we see actually is there is old influence there from old ASL. So the way that the sign for can was previously produced in ASL had the same orientation as the sign for can in Libras currently. So this sign does occur. And is this because of influence of ASL on Libras? And again, this is something that we need to further investigate before we can prove that claim. So, in conclusion, ASL, we can say that there is some influence, but we can't say fully about the level of influence. We've just started to look into this, but in terms of the phonological change, there may be some influence there. Some signs have remained the same since we have the first earliest recordings of Libras, and some have changed. Secondly, the second point on my slide here, in the Oates dictionary, there are some ASL signs that we don't necessarily see used in Libras. For example, the sign and. This isn't a sign that we see in Libras. This is a sign that we see very predominantly in ASL, but we don't see this sign in Libras. So in the Oates dictionary, we see this sign. Most of the signs are from Libras because it was documented by language usage in the country, but there are some signs there that came from the original use of ASL. So again, something interesting for us to consider there. The third point that I wanted to make was around how useful this text is, how useful Eugene Oates' dictionary is as a data source for studying the evolution of Libras. It's really important because it enables us to see how the language has evolved and to see how language has been used over time. So it's a very important text. And I think it's important that we respect the influence that that has on our language. The next point is around analysis of signs being collected locally. So we had the example there of the sign for find. No, sorry, the sign for have, which appears in the dictionary, but we have later found really is only used in the south of Brazil. So we know that Eugene worked all over Brazil, and signs were collected from the length and breadth of Brazil. And this isn't necessarily referenced very well in the dictionary. But thank you very much for giving me the time to present today. And I'll take questions. Lovely. Thank you very much for a really fascinating presentation there. We can now open the floor for questions. We have 8 minutes if people have questions that they would like to ask. Marta, question 1.
Just want to make sure I'm in the right spot. Do we need to pin me? Okay, lovely. So I have 2 primary questions. Thank you for your presentation. I found it to be very interesting. I really like the topic a lot. I love language contact, really thinking about the history of languages, the etymology of sign languages, the influences between sign languages. So we can see that there are a number of books in Brazil which make your work in terms of research much easier, because in Portugal, we don't really have that. We have to borrow from other sign languages, the documentation of other sign languages. But we have interviewed older deaf people who maybe have access to those linguistic resources that have been put to the wayside. So I'm just curious if you've interviewed older people who maybe remember specific signs that may not appear in dictionaries. And the second question that I have is with regards to the research of Brazilian Sign Language Libras and the influence of LSF. I'm curious about new additions to the language. For example, the sign for to be able to, we can see that there's an influence there perhaps, but I'm curious if there are other languages that are currently impacting the language and causing some linguistic shift.
Okay, so just to go back to the first question there, not having a dictionary for lexical items and asking people about what they remember. Yes, that is possible. So one example was the sign that I shared earlier, which was against. Trying to find where that sign came from, I undertake quite a lot of research to try to understand where that sign was used. And actually, it was only then when I thought about asking people from different regions. So there's a story from the south for a young person using this sign. And they say this sign was used before because that's quite iconic. And then there was a man who went to school, the deaf school in Rio de Janeiro, for 2 years. And when he was in that school, his sign language was influenced. And then when he moved to the area, he started teaching. And then the sign changed. So he used the sign contra, against. And again, we see this influence there. So the dictionary, I think, is again important as a tool to show the history of change of sign language in Brazil. But of course, we don't have all of the stories. So in answer to your second question, in terms of this particular sign, that's not something that's come up in my research. I know that somebody else has undertaken some similar research on this area, looking at the emergence of this sign. So Rodrigo Machado, who I think you'll be familiar with, Marta, has done some research into this, and but he's looked very much at the use of signing within particularly academic circles, and he said that around 10% of signs are borrowings. But again, he hasn't necessarily broken that down into which languages those borrowings have occurred from, but there's mixtures of international sign, ASL, LSF, etc. So thank you. Wonderful. And the next question, please. Adrien?
Thank you for this lovely presentation. It was very interesting. So I'm just curious how you know if something is borrowed from another language, if it's a lexical borrowing or if it's just a function of iconicity. For example, the sign for to eat. So the sign for to eat is very iconic, so it may not necessarily be influenced from another sign language, but rather may have its own iconic origins that are just common sense.
Thank you for that question, Adrien. Have you seen that sign being used though? I think do you see that sign in other countries? Yeah. So Adrien said he has seen that sign being used. And yes, I think we need more research into that. And is that borrowing or is that something that's more iconic? It is very difficult to discern whether sometimes a sign is derived from its iconic properties or whether it's a borrowing. Again, I think the lexical item would probably look slightly different. I think if it purely be iconic, I don't know. So it's maybe derived from there initially, but I think it's very hard to have a binary separation between those two categories. But in Libras, people never sign eat like is seen as an iconic sign in other countries. So that is what makes me think it's more lexical than iconic. Wonderful. We probably have time for one more question if it's a short question. Nobody online has a short question? And if not, let's thank Débora for that wonderful presentation. And now we will invite our next presenter, Marah, to come forward and present on her topic. Thank you very much.
Practice. Hello?
Hello?
Can interpreters hear us?
We can, yeah.
The interpreter. You see? Okay, I'm going to speak. Yeah, so you're going to speak. So the next, we have to inform the interpreter. So that they are prepared.
Okay. Okay, interpreters, Marah is going to speak. Oh yeah. Is that what we want?
Yeah. Now we can. You can hide me. Yeah. Why you doing? It's okay with you when you do like this. Okay, yeah, yeah. No worries. The only thing I think would be interesting if you can have it next to it. This is one, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can extend it, yeah.
Okay, they can see it on their screen. It's got full screen interpreter.
Yes, do you want me to open it?
Let's just go ahead.
Should I start?
Okay. Great. Okay. Good afternoon. Wait, is it?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marah Jaraisy. I'm a postdoc with the SignMorph team. The plan was to sign, I promise you that, but they informed me that my defense, my Viva, is next week, next Wednesday. So I didn't have any time to prepare, so I had to speak English, unfortunately. But I can sign. Right, so today's presentation is on referent tracking in the Kufr Qassem deaf community. This study is a cross-generational study, and it's part of my PhD. So I'd like to start with a positionality statement of who I am in relation to the community under investigation. So I'm Palestinian Arab, born and raised in what is now known as Israel, originally from Nazareth. I'm hearing, as you can see, my first language is Arabic, but I'm also bimodal multilingual, and here I'm listing only the languages that are relevant for this study. The Kufr Qassem deaf community is also Palestinian Arab from Kufr Qassem, which is an hour and a half away from Nazareth. But they're deaf, and their first languages are the local sign language, which is only used in that town, KQSL, or Kufr Qassem Sign Language, and the national sign language, Israeli Sign Language, or ISL. So the reason why I'm presenting this is because who you are as a researcher is not necessarily, you're not just an outsider or just an insider. For someone like me, for example, some aspects of my identity, I'm an insider, so I'm Palestinian Arab like them, but in others, I'm an outsider. So I'm hearing they're deaf. And I'm going to go back to this point at the end of this presentation. So a little introduction about the community. Deafness appeared around 1910 due to consanguineous marriage, so first cousin marriage that resulted in the transmission of a recessive gene for deafness, and a local sign language, KQSL, emerged around the 1930s. Now, this type of sign languages are called micro-community sign languages, and that means that they are only used in a single town or a single village. Usually the social network density is a bit denser than larger communities. Kufr Qassem is the home of 150 deaf people in a town of 25,000 people. 4 living generations have been identified. Many of them, if not all of them, are sign bilingual, so meaning that they use both ISL and KQSL. In this study, we focus only on the 3 oldest generations, because at the time of the data collection, the 4th generation, they were kids, they were too young. So with time, literacy across generation has increased. So the first generation that did not go to school, did not receive any formal education. Some people from the 2nd generation did, many dropped out. The 3rd generation received full formal education. Some of them even went to universities and colleges. Mobility has also increased. So as you can see, the 3rd generation is way more mobile than the 1st generation, and that's because between 1948 and 1966, the Israeli government imposed military governing on Palestinian citizens of Israel, restricting their movement, meaning that people could not leave their hometown without a permit. And so as the mobility increased, social interaction with outsiders increased as well. And since outsiders, especially deaf people, do not use KQSL because it's only used in that town, exposure to and the use of ISL has also increased. And that also because of literacy. So because schools, deaf schools, use ISL as the language of instruction, the exposure to and the use of ISL has also increased. But unfortunately, exposure to and the use of KQSL has decreased. So today, KQSL is considered endangered. So today we have 3 generations coming from different sociolinguistic backgrounds. The first generation, yes, they're all bilinguals, but the first generation is KQSL dominant. The second generation as well, but they use more ISL. The third generation, here you can see an extreme language shift using ISL as their preferred and dominant language in day-to-day use. But despite this really interesting sociolinguistic circumstances, only a few studies have been conducted in recent years. And all of these studies have considered the changes in the sociolinguistic circumstances and how they influence language use. And this is not based on nothing. The field of sociolinguistics have long suggested a link between social ecology and language use. But the discourse on the pragmatic levels have received very little attention. And so this is what we're doing in this study. We are investigating the use of semiotic strategies to track reference in narratives across these 3 generations. Now, what do I mean by semiotic strategies? When we tell a story in spoken languages, we use words. We use different strategies and referring expressions to keep track of reference. In sign languages, we have signs, and research has identified different sign types that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, why narratives? Narratives are amazing. They include multi-layered, complex events, multiple characters. They are an integral part of our daily communication. And so they offer great insight on, meaning making and maintaining coherence in discourse. Right, so the semiotic strategies I'll be looking at in this study, we start with pointing. So this is not very different from the pointing gestures hearing people use. You can use concrete pointing, so you can point to something in your immediate environment to draw attention to it. Or there's something also called abstract pointing. And this is in sign languages especially. This is when you assign a location in the signing space to a specific referent. And every time you want to talk about that referent, you go back to that location. So if I'm talking about a girl and a boy, I can kind of point to the right and say girl. And then if I want to talk about the boy, I can say boy and then point to the left. But it doesn't mean that I can only use my index finger. You can use so many articulators, different fingers, lips, face, torso, anything. Finger spelling. This is a system of highly conventionalized informed signs that represent letters from the writing system of the surrounding spoken language. So some sign languages have a one-handed system like ASL, American Sign Language. Some sign languages have a two-handed system like BSL. Some sign languages don't have any finger spelling system like KQSL. Lexical signs. These are highly conventionalized pairings of form and meaning. In spoken languages, think of words, right? Some lexical signs in sign languages are iconic and some are not. Depicting signs. This is where we start seeing a bit more flexibility in form. So these are partly conventionalized signs that depict a reference, movement, handling, so the way we use it, size, shape, as I said, movement. So if I want to depict a person moving or walking, I can use this hand shape, right, resembling the 2 legs. And the hand shape stays the same, but I can change the movement. So I can walk in zigzag, I can walk fast, I can walk in different directions. So there's a bit more flexibility here. And my absolute favorite semiotic strategy is constructed action. Those are a combination of non-manual features, so facial expressions, and gestures, so less conventionalized gestures. And this type of strategy can occur on its own, and or with other semiotic strategies that I just mentioned. And actually use that as hearing people all the time, especially after something we call quotative-like. So if I want to explain, sort of talk about my shock when I saw, I don't know, something scary, I can go, and I was like, ah! So that's constructed action. So I'm depicting a character's or my past self's sort of emotions, actions, feelings, mannerisms. And I'm going to give you an example from the study. This is the stimulus we used, actually. It's a silent film by Charlie Chaplin. So I'm going to play it now. So I don't know when to start. Yeah. Right, so you can see that the main event of this scene is that Charlie Chaplin is looking down at the dog. And indeed, that's what the signer is doing. So with his right hand, he is signing the sign for look. But if you look at his torso moving forward, his facial expressions showing shock, that's constructed action. But you can see that the sign for look is pointing to an empty area in the signing space, but there's nothing there. But from context, we know that this location has been assigned to the dog. This is called invisible surrogate, and it's not a sign type per se. And I included a photo of my dog Mish Mish because he is the cutest, and you all deserve to see it. So, invisible surrogate, it's not a sign type per se. It's an outcome of an indexing action. So all the semiotic strategies I mentioned earlier, those can be examples of indexing actions if pointed to a certain point in the signing space. And the referent only exists in the signer's mind and that of the interlocutor. So the dog, we don't have to have a dog there to know that we're talking about the dog, but because this location has been assigned to the dog, we can both imagine the dog. So it's invisible, it's an invisible surrogate. Now, what affects the use and the pattern of these semiotic strategies? Some studies have found that the nature and structure of narratives affect the pattern, affect the use. So we start with something called activation status of reference. And research has identified 3 stages. So we start with introduction of reference. So this is when we newly introduce it into the story. Maintaining, so that's when I sort of give more information about the referent. Introduction, so I could talk about different characters, but then I talk about that first referent, and that's called reintroduction. And people have found, research have found that semiotic strategy patterns change according to the stage. So I'm going to introduce the animacy first. So animacy of reference, so whether it's a human, an animal, an object. So for example, some studies have found that to maintain a human referent, people use more constructed action. To introduce more animate reference, people use lexical signs, for example, more often than constructed action, for example. Another set of factors are sociolinguistic factors, and here I'm providing a list of some sociolinguistic factors that have been talked about, but I want to focus on the last point: community size, social network density, and the social interaction frequency. So a study by Stamp and Sandler 2021 found that signers, that's supposed to be signers, not signs, sorry. Signers of KQSL, which is a micro community sign language, use more constructed action. So it's a less conventionalized, more iconic strategy compared to that of ISL signers who use a macro community sign language, they use more depicting signs. Right. So we have a couple of arguments to explore here. First is that the sociolinguistic factors and those relating to narrative structure and nature and how they might affect the pattern of semiotic strategies. And the second one is that micro-community sign languages may rely more on context-based and less conventionalized devices than macro-community sign languages. And keep in mind that this community uses both, uses a micro-community sign language and a macro-community sign language. So to conduct this study, as I said before, we used a narrative retelling task of Charlie Chaplin, a scene by Charlie Chaplin, 12 participants, 3 from the first generation, 3 from the second, and 6 from the third. And we looked at 2 levels. So we looked at the overall proportion of each sign type and the patterns, so in relation to the animacy and the activation status. And we did not find any generational differences, so no age effect here. But since generation aligns with education, aligns with language preference, also neither factor appears to influence language use in this context. But we do see general patterns across the entire community. So as you can see, lexical signs constitute the majority of the semiotic strategies. But then if you look at constructed action, it constitutes almost third. And if we compare it to other studies that looked at a macro community sign language, for example, like Auslan, we can see that constructed action is way higher than that of the study of on Auslan. And we start wondering why. Is it really because micro community sign languages or people who come from small deaf communities use more constructed action? Possibly, and I'm going to go back to that point in a second, but I also want to show you some similarities. So in terms of patterns, we found that lexical signs were used to introduce human reference, constructed action to maintain human reference, depicting signs to introduce objects, and invisible surrogate to maintain and reintroduce inanimate objects. And here we're talking about a small deaf community, but still, we found the same or similar patterns when we compared to studies that looked at macro community sign languages. So we see both similarities and differences. So what does that mean? Yes, the first is that might be shaped by sociolinguistic factors. So we saw that they use a lot of constructed action. Now, what is constructed action? That's basically gestures, right? Deaf people gesturing. And since the Kufr Qassem deaf community comes from an Arab culture, and, you know, Arabs like to gesture, that could be related to the more general gesture norms, but that obviously needs much more work because this is very speculative. This is based on perception and not based on any empirical work, but it's something to think about. But the differences might also come from methodological factors, and this is where we kind of complicate the relationship between social ecology and language use. First, it could be that because KQSL and language use in the Kufr Qassem deaf community is limited, so the research is limited, it could be that what we coded or what we annotated as less conventionalized signs, those could very well be actually lexical signs, but we don't know that because we don't have enough research. So this is how limited language documentation could affect the results. Researcher background. So this is where I come back to my positionality statement. I'm from Nazareth. Yes, I'm Palestinian, but I'm an outsider. So maybe I'm imposing some kind of, annotation system from sign languages that I'm more familiar with, used in the Western world. But it doesn't mean that, maybe someone from Kufr Qassem might code it in a different way. and also the stimulus. So if you look at the this, for example, Frog, Where Are You is a picture book, a wordless picture book. Boy Who Cried Wolf is an English text. Our stimulus is a silent film, a lot of mime. So it could be that the constructed action is linked to the type and nature of the stimulus. And actually, in a very recent study that actually was published a couple of weeks ago, I think, on Finnish Sign Language, they also found that in video stimulus, people use more constructed action. So that could be linked to the methodology and not necessarily to the relationship between social ecology and language use. I'm done. But the whole point of this study is to kind of say, before we jump into conclusions about the relationship between social ecology and language use, maybe sometimes we need to step back and consider other factors like methodology. Thank you very much, and special thanks to people on this slide. Yeah, thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Marah. What an interesting presentation and what interesting research. So we have about 9 minutes for questions and comments. Do we have any questions or comments from the room or online? If not, maybe I can start us off. Just want to make sure that the interpreter is... Oh, we don't have any interpreter online. Are we okay? There's no interpreter voiceover. We're not hearing any interpreter voiceover.
I can hear an interpreter voicing over.
Oh, that's the sound.
Can you hear me now? The people online can hear me.
Okay.
Again.
Yeah, but then
Can we hear the interpreter now? The people online can hear the interpreter, it seems. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so anyway, lovely research. Do we have any questions? We have about 9 minutes or so. And it looks like there's someone online. Hassan has a question. Hello. And is the interpreter okay? Hopefully you can see me. Thank you. Okay, what a lovely presentation, a great talk. I am particularly fascinated because within Israel, there are these minority communities. We have the Al Said Bedouin sign language community as well, and we have the Qasr Kufa. What is the sign for that? Oh, okay, it's like this. Great. So we have these different communities. So you didn't show any clips of the sign language, but I'm just curious what the community looks like, if it's still in use, if people still continue to use this sign language, or if it's decreasing in usage, or if people move to other parts of maybe go into the Israeli deaf community. The second question that I have is with regards to the Charlie Chaplin clip. We can see that there's a lot of, that 27% of the results were classifiers, and I'm just really curious why it would be the case for the KQSL community in ways where that is not being presented in Western Sign Languages. I'm wondering if they are sort of copying or mimicking his production, like on the body, or if it has something to do with something else. So if you could expand on that, that would be great.
Right.
Is it okay?
Yeah. Two great questions. So the first one is you asked about the use of KQSL and if it's still being used. I didn't show any videos. There are a few reasons for that. Mostly because many people don't want to show their faces or kind of like make their videos public. And something important to keep in mind is that this community is conservative, and I need to respect that. So the photo of the person I included, I know that he provided consent for his photos to be published elsewhere. But for other people, especially older people who use KQSL, I don't have consent to show that. Yes, Israel has quite a few sign languages, and not only ABSL or KQSL, but there are 3 other sign languages that have been identified. And if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to kind of share a new study that will be published very soon on why we have so many sign languages in Israel. The second question was about Charlie Chaplin and why do we have a high frequency of constructed action? Yes, that was my point, and I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. As I mentioned, the stimulus, the fact that it's a silent film, the fact that it's moving pictures, the fact that it's mime could have influenced the frequency of constructed action, which is basically gestures. So yes, our point here is that it could very well be that they are mimicking the movement and the facial expressions of Charlie Chaplin. Hope I answered the question.
Hopefully my answer to that question was clear. So we do have another online question. So we are going to bring the person up. Just one moment.
Hi, sorry, just had a little bit of technical trouble. Kate Huddleston here from South Africa, from Cape Town. I just wanted to say that in terms of the previous answer about methodology and the effect of the stimulus on the type of data you get, there was a recent issue, special issue of Open Linguistics on classifier hand-shaped choice in different sign languages. And the stimulus was a lot, for most of the studies, was the Tweety and Sylvester cartoons, also silent films in a sense. And just from our data, we haven't finished our analysis yet. So we're not in, our study isn't included, but just from my initial analysis, we also observe in South African Sign Language a lot of constructed action that we're not seeing to the same extent in other contexts. Thank you.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Thank you so much. I'm very interested in South African Sign Language. I have so many questions on South African Sign Language, but I think I'm gonna leave it. I can email you. But yeah, that's so interesting. It could very well be connected to the culture, but I feel like the only way of knowing that is if we actually conduct some empirical study to kind of see the differences in gesture frequency.
I'll sign. I'll go ahead and sign. I just wanted to add to this point. When we have constructed action, we know from the research, when we look at Black American Sign Language, we also have more constructed action. So, of course, there is very possibly a lot of variation that follows culture. So I think we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Marah. So now we will be moving on to our discussion with Alwin. So I'm going to be going ahead and speaking to introduce you.
Okay, so now we're going to start the discussion session. And for that, we're very happy to have here Alwin Kloekhorst from the University of Leiden, a historical linguist that doesn't work on sign languages, but actually he works with ancient Anatolian languages. So we thought it would be really fruitful conversation to bring his insights just to put together all the information that we've collected in these presentations, and then just like give us some input from your own personal perspective. Yeah, so the floor is yours, and then you can just manage the discussion yourself. Yeah. Just like that, I'm going to ask you to stand here, and there you go.
Thank you very much, Gerardo, and also thank you to Victoria for the invitation to be the discussant here. So I'm also from Leiden University, working on diachronic change in spoken languages. I don't know much about sign languages at all, but I'm very interested to see whether we could apply the principles for the study of diachronic change in spoken languages to sign languages as well. What are the things that they have in common? What are differences? Well, and I've seen, I think in the last, this morning, quite a few things that we have in common, but also quite a lot of differences. So I think that's going to be a very interesting thing. First, yesterday I had dinner with Gerardo and Kate, who's here as well. We talked about the fact that historical linguistics is very much viewed as something that deals with ancient language stages because these are written down and that you can track language change over centuries. And that's certainly true in that sense. I think that Débora's lecture was very interesting because she works really with ancient written sources on previous stages of languages. So I think the way she approaches that is very much what you can do with spoken languages as well. So I think there's a lot of overlap there. But of course, you can also study the diachrony of languages, not by only looking at earlier attested or written down stages, but also by comparing different dialects or language varieties that are related to each other. And the idea is that if you have different dialects or varieties that are related, that they descend from a single mother language, and you should be able to sort of reconstruct what that mother language looked like, which automatically implies that you have historical changes that you have to map in order to explain the differences, different outcomes of a single input, right? And that is also what Débora has been doing, the influence of other sign languages, but I also was very fascinated by Adrien's things about the change of signs through time, how that works. I think that's a thing that we could perhaps first talk about. And so in spoken language, what you see is that a lot of change has to do with phonological change in the sense that sounds change, and it's usually through lenition. So you get a sort of reduction of sounds because people are getting more lazy. They don't want to put as much energy anymore, as long as the meaning can be conveyed with the least amount of energy possible. And I wonder whether that goes for signs as well. You have these signs that change through what looks like a reduction. I think the red example from Débora was very interesting. If it really comes from first whiskers, but then sort of gets reduced, or signs that are with two hands that get reduced to one hand signs, or the compounds. someone's talking about compound signs that are reduced. Is it then that the two signs merge into a single one, or does one of the signs really drop out of the compound? How does that work? Could you say perhaps a bit about that? Phonological change in these signs? And I would also be interested to what extent then, if you have a sort of reduction in a type of sign, whether other signs that have the same type of movement in that sign would show the same type of reduction in that specific movement, right? That's in phonological change a very basic principle that if, for instance, an S turns to an H in intervocalic position, it does so in all the words in the language. Do you have reduction of signs that then apply to all the signs that have the same type of movements, or is that not the case? Anyone who has something to say about that? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for raising this. It's an interesting point. I think in terms of seeing a reduction in lexical items, a lessening of lexical items, I suppose some of that is about communicative effort. But also I think some of that might be in terms of other influence as well. So maybe just the linguistic influence. In terms of compounds that I mentioned, and then maybe compound one sign being dropped, I think again that might be about clarity of and effort of communication as well. I think we do still see some compounds in Libras, but just less so than we might have done previously. I think familiarity with those signs, because those signs are used a lot, means that there's maybe not necessarily the effort. And we do actually see in older populations them using both signs in a compound, but we don't see that in younger generations at all. That's been a real shift. So yes, there could be more phonological shift there, but definitely, yeah. I think in terms of the phonology there and the morphology as well, I think morphological adaptations there, there's certainly influence in that way. But thank you. Yeah, interesting comments there. I'll sign, yep. So me and Rose, when we started researching in 2021, we did find a compound. So if I back up a little bit, so myself and Rose published a paper in 2021, and that was about compounds in KQSL. So this sign for married, spouse, so person married as the term for spouse, but also the sign for man. So the compound is spouse, but the first part of that compound sign is man. And the second part of that is woman. So if so it's a little unclear which gender it was, but then in the second generation we saw a change in this sign. So for example, the sign we saw was wife, so the sign to mean wife. And this was a compound of two female signs, so two KQSL signs. So the sign for woman and the sign for girl. And this became to mean the sign for wife in the second generation of KQSL signers. And then in the third generation of KQSL signers, we saw a strong influence of ISL into the vocabulary that was being used. And this second part of the compound was lost, and we saw a borrowing of the ISL sign for woman. So we saw a compound made up of a KQSL sign and an ISL sign. And now we see this sign for wife. So it's not phonological. I suppose it's more morphological shift rather than phonology. Is that clear as a response to that? Yeah, ISL is Israeli Sign Language. Sorry, yeah, ISL, Israeli Sign Language. I'm going to speak.
Okay, so yeah, your question about regular sound change, for example, the fact that in many Indo-European languages, you've got like systematic change where the words that contain P have all changed to F and things like that. Okay, there is a paper out at the moment in Language and Linguistics Campos written by Justin Power and colleagues, which talks about historical sign linguistics and the challenges that we have around this. There isn't any evidence for regular hand shape, movement, and location changes in sign languages. Not historically anyway. It doesn't see, we don't have it. We have two problems. First, there is the lack of documentation. So although for Libras, we have excellent documentation of earlier lexical, signs, much more than like, for example, I work on Auslan, Australian Sign Language. We don't have the same degree of lexical documentation that they have for Libras for Auslan. But of course, the problem with relying on dictionaries is we know that variation is related to change, and we don't know how representative those older books are of variation that existed. But we do have studies looking at trying to use apparent time. So looking at variation and change in synchronic data, and we do see some patterns, like we see systematic hand shape assimilation in signs with this hand shape, for example. We see systematic location assimilation with signs in the outer regions of the signing space moving to the center. So we do see some systematic kinds of patterns, but again, it's not, we see this is all in flux, so there's a lot of variation. So some signs drop more to the center than others. So we found in our work, high frequency signs drop more to the center than other ones. So it's really complicated. We don't yet have anything like evidence for the kind of regular sound changes. It seems to be much more lexically driven. We do see changes like the ones on compounds, which I think are to do with phonological reduction. But it's really, it's a really fascinating area. But the problem, of course, is the lack of historical documentation of sign languages as the source of data. Like Libras is very lucky to have those kinds of dictionaries going back into the 19th century. We don't have anything really like this for BSL or Auslan, not to the same extent. So yeah, that's the big problem for us.
Yeah, so I've two things that you mentioned that really trigger me are the assimilation thing. That's of course in phonological change also very much the same as sounds assimilating to each other. But apparently with signs you do have that as well.
I think the important thing is to forget about the sound change is based on vocal gestures, right? So it's all about the body. So sign languages and spoken languages are based on physical actions, right? So you get a reduction in effort of the physical actions. So of course this is going to occur both in sign languages and spoken languages, because effectively what you're thinking about when you come to phonetics of speech is gesture.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's fascinating indeed. And the frequency of words, of course, that's also a very important thing. And this also was what I think who's yeah, maybe Marta's talk about which words from the international sign language are then taken over in the Portuguese sign language. And does it apply more to the non-frequent words? So is there a distinction between something that you could call core vocabulary and the non-core vocabulary? And that would be interesting as well to see whether these are useful categories, core vocabulary not being influenced that much by loan words, taking over signs from international sign language. And apparently also the core vocabulary being more open to gesture reduction and assimilation than non-core vocabulary. So I think if we can establish that, that's a very important thing to compare the diachronic changes in spoken language with those in sign languages. That would be very interesting. So is that the case that if words are borrowed from international sign language influences Portuguese sign language, it's not affecting core vocabulary, so pronouns and verbs like to have or to be or to be able, these kinds of things? Does that make sense? Core vocabulary, I mean the words that are used most often in a language. Yes, Marta, I'm asking you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I have to do some.
Okay. In terms of the research that I've been doing, I've been looking at two different ways this influence happens. So one is lexicon. So for example, the same sign being used in different places. So people seeing that sign often and then copying that sign. And that tends to be more things that are slang, like we might say they're slang signs. So for example, I don't know how this would be translated into English, but like the worst of the worst. So like this sign, something that's really subpar, suboptimal, or this sign as well that we see. It's a slang sign that's used in international sign that means somebody sort of has bought into something that they shouldn't have bought into, has been duped. We also see this sign as well, which is a slang sign, which is more like, oh, I've just given up on that thing. And now amongst young people, we're seeing lots of lexical borrowing of these kind of slangs, informal signs, and they're used a lot. They're used across a wide variety of different topics by signers. So hopefully that goes some way to answer your question.
Yeah.
So signs like have and can, yeah, we do see that. But I don't, yes, no, not in the same way, I don't think. Not the same way they were suggesting. Do you want to come to the front and ask that question, or I just like a little bit of clarity on Marta's response. So I know that we've talked about lexical items in IS, so can and have, for example, signs that are used every day. For example, the sign for for can, that's a very high frequency sign. And I'm just wondering, in Portuguese Sign Language, do we see those signs being borrowed more from IS? But I know you talked about slang signs, but are these high frequency signs borrowed as well, such as can and have? I think when I've undertaken a linguistic ethnography, the thing that's really stuck out to me is the use of slang signs. But it's more across the board borrowing by younger deaf people as well. So yes, I see the sign have, I see the sign can, I see the repeated signs of these for emphasis. So I think, yes, across the younger generation, these signs, many of these signs are all borrowed. If young people are having frequent international sign contact every day, more than they're having contact in Portuguese Sign Language, then the signs are, signs from international sign are across the board borrowed, not just these slang signs that I mentioned.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's very interesting, interesting indeed. So yeah, it would seem that perhaps with borrowing, it works a bit differently in sign languages than it does in spoken languages. So that will be a different way of, if you want to study historical changes, to take that into account. So that is a very important thing. And another thing I was also struck with was in Adrien's talk about to give. So Adrien, can you say something about why the sign for to give is reduced from two hands to one hand when it is used in its lexical meaning, but not in its causative meaning? Why would that be the case? That's a very fascinating thing to me.
Thank you for that question. There could be a number of reasons. So the first one could be that it's more efficient. So to just use one hand is obviously more efficient, more economical. There could be other reasons in terms of thinking about how to separate out other elements. If you think about iconicity, there could be iconic reasons too. So for example, in terms of being able to do more with the sign, so being able to exchange two books, if you use two hands there, one to represent each book rather than using two signs for each book, which wouldn't make so much sense in terms of iconicity. Also, maybe a third reason is around clarity of separating different things out as well. So, for example, separating out the lexical use and separating out the lexical sign for give and the causative sign for give. So if you're using two hands, maybe having the separation of using one or two hands gives more clarity in that respect, that it's causative or not causative. So that could be another reason for that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's very yeah, that's very interesting. But there would also be a distinction then with spoken languages, where you often see that words that get grammaticalized into, for instance, light verbs do also undergo phonological reduction more than when they are retained in their lexical meaning. And this would then be the opposite. So that's interesting. But would it mean that you then synchronically would have to distinguish two different signs now that are, well, if you would write a dictionary, that you have to really make them distinct, so they have a single origin, but they've, driven apart from each other? Would you do that if you were a lexicographer?
Oh, thank you. Good question. Good question. I think in the dictionary we just see one example of this. So if somebody was wanting to learn LSF and they were looking to the dictionary, they wouldn't see more than one explanation of this, so they wouldn't be aware that both of these options existed, so that lexical give and the causative give, that this wouldn't be extrapolated in the dictionary. I think when we're thinking about this work moving forward, I would hope that we respect the systems that are in place within LSF and had better clarification around this. And I think one of the things that we know about the creation of sign language dictionaries and the recording of sign language is that it always follows the spoken language. They don't really thinking about dictionaries from a sign language perspective. It's the copying of signs in an English or French dictionary format. I think there are some other countries, for example, Libras. Does that follow the use of the sign, or does it follow like a structure of Portuguese, the definition of how these things would be created? Like, I just think it tends to follow so there's this word from the spoken language and then the corresponding sign, and not the other way around. And that doesn't really allow us to fully see all of the properties of sign language in a dictionary form.
Yeah, that sounds like there's still a lot of work to do then. So, yeah, that's very interesting. And then I still have time, or
2 more minutes, just
okay.
wrapping up.
One last question. Do you also get at a certain time a merger of signs if you have a little bit decay or assimilation, that two previously distinct signs become the same? Does that happen as well in sign languages, or is that, or is that not a thing at all? Because that's, of course, in diachronic chains of spoken languages very often the case. But is that something that happens in sign languages? Yeah, Victoria? You gonna sign?
So yeah, with regards to merging signs, absolutely. So for example, we have an example from Old French Sign Language. This sign, which means paper or supervisor. How do you sign paper in French Sign Language? Paper, papier. How do you sign it in French Sign Language? Aha. Right. So this is how you sign it, right?
Sorry, Victoria, you're quite far away from the screen. If you could be closer, that would be helpful to us. Thank you.
And then we have this, de la porte. So de la porte actually researched and found that this sign actually previously had two separate meanings that have then merged to become one sign. So we had this sign here, or two separate signs that have merged to become one sign. So we have this sign and then this other sign, which comes from papier. So, sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think. No, So I think I have to wrap it up, right? But fascinating stuff. So I think we have a lot of more to talk about during lunch and afterwards. But thanks very much. I've learned a lot, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alvin. Thank you very much. Hey. Well, indeed, really fascinating series of talks, fascinating discussion, and this is definitely going to give us more opportunity to chat. We would like to stop officially the second edition of the Leiden Birmingham lecture series. Victoria? You okay? Yeah. So just want to thank the presenters again. Thank you very much for your time and for your really fascinating presentations. Thank you for the discussant, Alvin. Thank you very much for your really amazing work. Interpreters, thank you so much for all your help. The tech team at the back, thank you so much. It saved us last minute. Glaucia, it's probably remote. Glaucia did a lot of work behind the scenes, so thank you very much for her. Everybody attending, thank you very much for all the love and appreciation. Victoria, would you like to?
No, just to say the same as you wanted to say there. Thank you all so much to everybody. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate everybody for coming. Thank you very much. We'll now close, and people in the room will be taking a lunch break. Thank you to everybody who's joined us online, and goodbye. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to stop here. Hello, interpreters. Hello, Day. I can see you there. So just as per the program, we're just going to stop for 1 hour for lunch, and we start again in an hour at 2 English time.
Sorry, in 1 hour or at 2, because it's 1:10 now. Are you starting at 2 again?
Oh, yes, Day?
Yes. I don't think you heard Naomi's
1 second,
question.
give me 1 second. I'm pinning you for a second.
I'm
Yes.
having problems. I'm having some problems with my. I'll need to leave and come back in. We're still using this link.
Yeah.
Can you
hear Naomi? No.
Can you hear me, Day? Can you ask the question that I'm asking? Okay, thank you, Day.